Let's talk about open face helmets in the late medieval period. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, many of you will have watched my videos in the past on armour where I've talked about some of the virtues of more convenient types of helmet. And it should be obvious to anyone, if you've watched my recent Great Bassinet video, that the Great Bassinet, whilst it is absolutely optimal in terms of protection, certainly for fighting on foot, and if you were jousting, something like a frog-mouth helm would be the ultimate level for that. Neither of those are very convenient helmets to be wearing in a day-to-day kind of on-campaign basis. They need to be secured to the cuirass, so you need someone to help you do that. You can't get them off very easily by yourself. I won't say you can't do it, but it's not very convenient by yourself, especially ones which are strapped at the back. You literally can't do that yourself. But moreover, even just, bending down to pick things up or eating or drinking, various types of everyday activity on campaign, they would not be convenient to wear. Whereas very obviously a helmet like this, which we'll talk about what it is in a second, is really, really convenient. In fact, functionally, this is really not very different to a modern helmet that you would find a modern soldier wearing. Obviously, it's made of steel rather than Kevlar or anything else. But fundamentally, it leaves the same amount of the face open. And a lot of people go, oh, well, isn't your face really, really vulnerable? Well, you could say that with modern helmets as well. But people don't wear full face protection in the modern world for a whole bunch of reasons. One of those being that you have to operate a rifle. And if you've got full facial protection, not very compatible. It can be done with different types of sights and goggles and other types of things. That's something probably for another channel, let alone another video. But the fact is that open face helmets are the most practical, compromised design for head protection plus being able to do your job. Now, I think most people will realise that people like crossbowmen or gunners or archers very often need open face helmets. But what about knights? Well, often they do as well, and in fact it's incredibly common in the 15th and 16th centuries to find an armour equipped with a selection of different helmets. So just because you have full plate harness on your body doesn't mean you're always going to wear your most protective helmet, your close helmet, your armet or your great bassinet or your jousting helm, with that armour in all situations. If you're just on general campaign, often a sallet, and this doesn't have a visor, again we'll come back to that in a second, a visored sallet or an unvisored sallet or a chapeau de fer is going to be more practical. So those are all kind of obvious things. Right, very briefly, what is this helmet and why does it look like this? So this is a type of open-faced sallet that was popular in England, Burgundy, Flanders and France as well, relatively. Now, a lot of people would describe this as an English sallet, and in a sense they're correct, because this is actually made by Ash Armour Services Historical, based on a number of English effigies. There's about 6 that fall into this group, and they're also shown in contemporary art, French, Burgundian, Flemish art as well. So we know that these helmets weren't only worn in England, but probably some of them were made in England by English armourers and were worn with English armours. But equally, there's a lot of commonality, shall we say, between armours found in France and the Low Countries and Burgundy, which owned some of the Low Countries at that time, and England. And of course, remember the historical context. So obviously up until 1454, the English were in France. They owned big chunks of France and were also allies of the Burgundians, those Burgundians who caught Joan of Arc and gave her to the English. Those Burgundians that when Edward IV was defeated and ran away with the Duke of Gloucester and his buddies, they ran away to his sister, who was married to the Duke of Burgundy, gathered an army and then came back and fought at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury in the Wars of the Roses. So the Burgundians and the English were inextricably closely linked. Right, that I could do a whole probably hour-long video by itself, but that's just a brief tangent. So this is a type of open face sallet you find in England, France, Burgundy, so on and so forth. And it would be completely normal for someone on campaign, a knight, a lord, even a king, to have a helmet like this that they would wear some of the time instead of their armor, their great bassinet, or whatever their heavy helmet was. So having a heavy helmet and a light helmet, sometimes maybe even having a spectrum of helmets, a super light helmet and a sort of medium level helmet, maybe a sallet without a bever or sallet and a bever, and then a heavy helmet for mounted work. And you might even have different helmets for foot and mounted. So you might wear an armet on horseback and you might wear a great bassinet on foot. So a bunch of different helmets, and that's what I'm going for essentially. So this is my campaign helmet, made by Ash, polished up by me. It was originally in satin finish, and I have mirror polished this to match my new armour, which, as aforementioned, will become unveiled soon. Right, so let's just shed this for a second and talk about the issue of open face versus closed face, and actually a sense of perspective. So people always say, Matt, isn't your face massively exposed with an open face? Yes, that's the compromise you're making. However, remember that a very big percentage of the soldiers on the battlefield also have open faces, okay? So that's the first thing, is that modern soldiers have open faces, World War I soldiers had open faces, most other periods of soldiers have open faces, Roman soldiers mostly had open face helmets, but even in the medieval context, most soldiers, be they billmen, archers, crossbowmen, gunners, whatever, on the medieval battlefield, have to some degree an open face. Secondly, this can be worn with a bever, so that you can close up half of the face with this and just leave a section open in the middle. Okay, so that's the second thing to mention. But here's the point I really wanted to make, and I don't think I've ever really put this in a video before. Let's take the visor from my great bassinet. So there's the detached visor. It attaches by pins on the sides. You can put different types of visors on. We're going to see a different visor in a second. And this seems like a closed face visor. However, it does have openings, and that's really important because you need openings to see and to breathe. Now, while these openings might be minimized and kept relatively small, so here we've got lots of small circular holes, difficult for things to get into those, although not impossible, and then you've got these slits here. It is absolutely not impossible for weapons to come into those. So if you're being shot with arrows, the fact is that if an arrow manages to find one of those breathing holes or vision holes, they're actually both, there is a chance that it can penetrate through the visor here. And we find this mentioned in Froissart. The French knights at Poitiers feared the storm of English arrows hitting them, particularly from the flanks. They feared that they would penetrate their visors, specifically visors, not the rest of their body, visors. So even a closed visor can be penetrated by weapons. And I think people often forget this because they look at things like Bohart videos where thrusting's not allowed, and obviously there's no arrows. Or they look at reenactment where, for the most part, thrusting at faces is not allowed. And in any way, the weapons are all blunt. And those big blunt-ended weapons, for the most part, won't go through the gaps here anyway. But if you're talking about sharp weapons, arrows, daggers, spears, swords, they can go through these gaps. Now, for illustration, I have a Todd Cutler dagger here. This is a rondel dagger. This is modelled on Frederick the Victorious's great bassinet, so it's historically accurate, the slits are the right size and everything else. I could grab one of my sallets and do a similar thing to this. I can't see where they are right now. But here we go. Nasty! So if you get into close combat with someone, two things to bear in mind. First of all, if you're really up close and personal, there's always going to be gaps. There's their groin, there's the inside of their armpits and elbows, back of the legs, back of the neck, behind the helmet, inside the gauntlets, both the palm and inside the cuff, and these holes can be compromised. Even really narrow slits on sallets and armets are enough to let a blade through if you get close enough to stick it in there. So not only can you deliberately stick a blade through the gap of a visor, you can also find other gaps to stab anyway, or potentially you can open the visor or pull a piece of plate off and stab into there. We see this in Pascal's treatise, where a pauldron is cut off and stabbed into. But additionally, just accidentally, so if thrusts are constantly coming in from spears, arrows, all sorts of other things, there is a chance they will penetrate this anyway. So, in a nutshell, even if you have facial protection, yes, it increases your odds of not getting stabbed or shot in the face, but it is never an absolute protection. Now, I'm just going to briefly, we'll talk about this more in a future video. I know I say that a lot on this channel, but here is a different type of visor, and clearly that's got big old holes in it. Now this is called in German a Kolbenturnier helm, but we will call it a tournament visor, and you see these in René Donjou's manuscript, and this is the alternate visor for my great bassinet, and you'll notice, yes, it's gilded, which gives you some clues about the rest of my armour. So this is an alternate visor for tournament use, and I can also use it for HEMA use, so long as the weapons don't have pointy ends on them, which for HEMA they don't usually. So this is very useful for fighting with wooden clubs or blunt swords which have wide ends and can't go through those holes, and it's brilliant for seeing, brilliant for breathing. It's similar to a fencing mask in principle, but much stronger bars and bigger holes. So you couldn't use this for a rapier because it goes straight through and stab you in the face. Now clearly these aren't great for war because you'd be shot through them, but here's the thing. You do see these in manuscripts worn in war. So sometimes some people somewhere, because of the added breathability and vision of this, would have chosen to wear the tournament visor instead of the so-called war visor. Because yes, indeed, arrows can come through and swords and other things, and obviously something like a dagger. So at the end of the day, it's all about context and compromise, because you can never have all things for all people at all times at once. You've got to make your choices. What is the specific tactical and strategic scenario? What is required of my armour? What am I going to wear? Clearly, this is the best option for a club or blunt sword tournament, as seen in René Donjou's tournament book. And clearly, on the battlefield, usually, if not always, usually, this is the best choice. But don't think for a second that just because you have a visor, it will always protect you against all things. It won't. The French knights at Poitiers were scared of it, and we know that people did get wounded and sometimes killed through visors. Moreover, just have a look at medieval art. The number of medieval illustrations there are where the helmet, be it a sallet or an armet or even a great bassinet, has a visor, but in the art, the people are fighting with their visors. Let's pull this up like that, okay? So if the people are fighting with their visors up like that, well, at this point, they've essentially got an open face. So yes, they might have advanced into the arrows, into the so-called arrow storm, or they might have charged in on horseback with their lance with their visor down. But as soon as they get into melee, the ability to see and breathe, more important. So, absolutely, obviously, when you're wearing helmets like this, number one, yes, your face is more exposed, but you gain a lot from that. Secondly, most soldiers on the medieval battlefield had open faces. Thirdly, just because you have access to full plate and visors and heavier helmets, you very often would choose this type of helmet for standard campaigning, and sometimes deliberately for close combat. And we know that English knights in the Wars of the Roses very often fought with open faces. Remember Henry V at the Battle of Shrewsbury back in 1403, I think it was, shot in the face with an arrow, ergo he had an open face or his visor up. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope this has been interesting and thought-provoking. If you've got any specific questions on this topic which might spur me into making future videos in a related thing, maybe something I've never covered in a video before, then by all means get posting down below. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, I will continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.